August 1945. A war room deep beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of impossible decisions. General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, stands before a map of Japan's home islands, his face illuminated by the harsh light of a single bulb. Across the map, red pins mark American positions. Blue pins represent Japanese defensive forces. The ratio tells a story no amount of courage can rewrite. For months, Japanese intelligence officers had been feeding reports into this room, reports of troop buildups, ship movements, aircraft deployments. The numbers kept growing. 300,000 American soldiers had seemed manageable, even suicidal for the Americans to attempt. But the latest estimates have shattered that calculation. Nearly 2 million men. The general's hand trembles slightly as he places another red pin near Kyushu. His staff officers stand in silence. They all understand what this means. The war they thought they could still win, the final battle they had promised the emperor would break American resolve, has become mathematically impossible. Outside, Tokyo lies in ruins from months of firebombing. Inside this bunker, the last illusions of Imperial Japan are dying with quiet arithmetic. The Pacific War had been a cascade of disasters for Japan, each one rationalized, each one survivable, until suddenly it was not. When Admiral Yamamoto's carrier struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the plan had been elegant in its desperation. Cripple the American fleet, seize the resources of Southeast Asia, build an impregnable defensive perimeter, and force the United States into a negotiated peace. Japan's leadership understood they could not defeat America in a protracted war. Their entire industrial output for 1941 equaled roughly 10% of American production. But they gambled that Americans, cushioned by distance and comfort, would not pay the price in blood required to cross the Pacific. They were catastrophically wrong. The United States transformed itself into an industrial leviathan that produced weapons at a scale Japan could not comprehend. By 1945, American shipyards were launching an aircraft carrier every month. Factories delivered a bomber every hour. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt had called it, had become the arsenal of annihilation. Japan's defensive strategy evolved as each island fell. After the disaster at Midway in June 1942, where 4 carriers were lost in a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an offensive force. The island-hopping campaign that followed, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, demonstrated a pattern that terrified Japanese planners. Each battle cost the Americans dearly. At Tarawa, nearly 1,000 Marines died taking a tiny atoll in 76 hours. At Iwo Jima, 27 Medals of Honor were awarded, 13 posthumously. But each time, no matter the cost, the Americans kept coming. More ships, more planes, more men. Japanese soldiers fought with a fanaticism that shocked American troops, choosing death over surrender at rates approaching 99%. Yet none of it mattered. The mathematics were inexorable. By early 1945, American bombers flew over Japan's cities almost at will. The Navy had blockaded the home islands, strangling imports of food and fuel. The vaunted kamikaze attacks, which had sunk dozens of ships off Okinawa, could not stop the tide. It was in this context that Japanese military planners developed Operation Ketsu-go, the defense of the homeland. If the Americans came, and everyone knew they would come, Japan would meet them on the beaches with every available soldier, civilian militia member, and schoolchild old enough to hold a sharpened bamboo spear. The plan called for concentrating forces on Kyushu, the southernmost home island, where intelligence suggested the Americans would land first. Japanese generals estimated they could marshal perhaps 2 million defenders, including hastily trained civilians. They had thousands of aircraft, many reserved for suicide missions. They had prepared coastal fortifications, hidden artillery in caves, and stockpiled what little fuel remained. The strategy was not to win, not exactly. It was to make the invasion so costly, so horrific in its casualties, that American public opinion would force a negotiated settlement that might preserve the emperor and some remnant of Japanese sovereignty. To make this work, Japanese planners needed the Americans to commit a force small enough to be bloodied, perhaps 300,000 men in the initial waves. Then the killing could begin. But American planning had evolved beyond anything Japan imagined. In the spring of 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved Operation Downfall, a two-phase invasion that made D-Day look like a rehearsal. Operation Olympic would strike Kyushu on November 1st, 1945, with 14 divisions, roughly 450,000 men in the assault forces alone. This was just the opening act. Operation Coronet would follow in March 1946, targeting the Kanto Plain and Tokyo itself with an additional 25 divisions. The total force, including reserves, logistics, and follow-on units, would exceed 2 million American servicemen, supported by the largest naval armada ever assembled, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, and a level of firepower that defied comprehension. The Americans had learned from Okinawa, where nearly 12,000 had died in 3 months of fighting. They were not underestimating Japanese resistance. They were preparing to crush it with overwhelming mass. The buildup began in secret, but could not remain hidden. By summer 1945, American forces were concentrating across the Pacific. Divisions that had fought in Europe were being redeployed, veterans of Normandy and the Bulge now bound for the final campaign. In the Philippines, staging areas swelled with men and materiel. On Okinawa, still reeking of death and cordite, engineers carved out airfields and supply dumps. In Hawaii, training intensified for amphibious operations on a scale never before attempted. Japanese intelligence, though degraded by years of war, still functioned. Radio intercepts picked up snippets of unit movements. Reconnaissance aircraft on rare missions that survived American fighter patrols photographed the massive concentrations. Agents in neutral countries forwarded reports of American divisions disappearing from European postings. Slowly, terrifyingly, the picture came into focus. The Americans were not sending 300,000 men. They were sending everything. In Tokyo, the mood in military headquarters shifted from determination to something approaching despair, though no one would voice it directly. The numbers were discussed in euphemisms: larger than anticipated forces, significant buildup beyond initial estimates. But when staff officers prepared their reports, when they calculated the ratios of attackers to defenders, when they projected casualties and consumption rates for ammunition that was already running short, the conclusion was inescapable. 2 million American soldiers, backed by naval gunfire that could level mountains, supported by an air force that had already burned Japan's cities to ash, this could not be stopped. Not by courage, not by sacrifice, not by divine wind. Every war game, every staff study reached the same endpoint. Japan would lose. The only variable was how many would die before the end. The atomic bombs were not yet part of this calculation. Little Boy and Fat Man, the uranium and plutonium devices being assembled on Tinian Island, remained among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Japanese intelligence had no idea that American scientists had unlocked the atom, that 2 weapons existed capable of destroying a city each. But even without this knowledge, by late July 1945, Japan's leaders understood their position was hopeless. The Soviet Union, which had maintained an uneasy neutrality in the Pacific, was clearly preparing for war. Intelligence reports from Manchuria showed massive Red Army buildups along the border. If the Soviets entered the war while the Americans invaded, Japan would face a two-front apocalypse. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito, who had remained largely passive throughout the war, began to ask pointed questions about casualties, about whether victory was truly possible. His advisors could not lie to him forever. The debates within Japan's government grew desperate. The military faction, led by War Minister Korochika Anami, argued for fighting to the last. Not because they believed they could win, but because they believed that dying in battle was preferable to the humiliation of unconditional surrender. They spoke of the 100 million dying together, of making the Americans pay in blood for every inch of Japanese soil. But even Anami knew what the numbers meant. His own staff had prepared the estimates. 2 million Americans in the first waves, with more to follow. Against this, Japan could field perhaps 2 million defenders, but many were poorly trained civilians armed with bamboo spears and improvised explosives. Japanese industry had collapsed. Oil reserves measured in days, not weeks. The Navy was gone, sunk or immobilized by lack of fuel. The Air Force existed mainly as kamikaze units, one-way missions that could damage but not defeat the invasion fleet. Every honest assessment reached the same conclusion. Operation Ketsu-go would fail. The Americans would land, fight through the defenders at hideous cost, and eventually reach Tokyo. Then what? Surrender anyway, but only after millions more were dead? The peace faction, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, used these realities to push for negotiation. If surrender was inevitable, better to end it now, preserve what could be preserved, protect the emperor, prevent the complete destruction of Japanese civilization. But the military would not budge on the question of unconditional surrender. They demanded guarantees, conditions, a settlement that saved face if not victory. The deadlock persisted through July, even as American bombs continued to fall, even as the noose tightened. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the invasion force continued to assemble. Soldiers wrote letters home, knowing what awaited them. Many would not return. Generals studied casualty projections that ranged from conservative estimates of 100,000 American dead to worst-case scenarios approaching 500,000. The Pentagon had manufactured so many Purple Hearts in anticipation of the invasion that the stockpile would supply casualties through the Korean War, Vietnam, and into the 21st century. Everyone knew downfall would be the bloodiest operation in American military history. But the alternative, allowing Japan to continue fighting, was unacceptable. Then on August 6th, everything changed. The Enola Gay, a B-29 superfortress, released Little Boy over Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning. 43 seconds later, the uranium bomb detonated at 1,800 feet with a force of 15 kilotons. The city center vaporized. 70,000 people died instantly. Tens of thousands more would succumb to radiation poisoning and burns in the days and weeks that followed. In Tokyo, the initial reports were confused, contradictory. A single bomb? Impossible. But as details filtered in, as reconnaissance flights revealed a city simply gone, replaced by a wasteland, the truth became undeniable. The Americans possessed a weapon of unimaginable power. The military faction scrambled for a response, argued that one city did not change the strategic picture, insisted that Japan could endure even this. But their arguments grew hollow. If the Americans had one such bomb, they likely had more. How many cities could Japan afford to lose? 3 days later, the second blow fell. Fat Man obliterated Nagasaki, killing another 40,000 instantly. But by then, an arguably more significant event had occurred. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with over 1 million troops. The Kwantung Army, once the pride of Imperial Japan, collapsed within days. The speed of the Soviet advance shocked even Stalin's generals. For Japan, this was the end of any hope for a negotiated peace. The plan had been to use Soviet mediation to reach a settlement that avoided unconditional surrender. With the Soviets now enemies, that door slammed shut. Japan faced atomic annihilation from the sky, Soviet armies from the west, and that assembling horde of 2 million Americans from the east and south. On August 9th, Emperor Hirohito intervened directly, overruling the military faction, and made the decision to accept the Potsdam Declaration's terms. Japan would surrender unconditionally with the sole condition that the emperor's position be preserved. Even then, the surrender was not immediate. Hardline officers attempted a coup to prevent the broadcast of Hirohito's surrender speech, believing they could continue the war. The coup failed, but it demonstrated how close Japan came to fighting on even after the atomic bombs, even after the Soviet invasion. But the numbers had spoken. The Japanese military understood that 2 million Americans would land, that Soviet armies would pour into Korea and Hokkaido, that atomic bombs would erase city after city. There was no path to victory, no path even to an honorable stalemate. There was only the choice between surrender with some Japanese still alive or annihilation pursued to its logical conclusion. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's voice, never before heard by the common people, crackled across radio speakers throughout Japan, announcing the unendurable must be endured. The war was over. Operation Downfall never occurred. Those 2 million American soldiers never stormed the beaches of Kyushu. The thousands of ships and bombers remained poised but unused. For decades afterward, Historians debated whether the atomic bombs were necessary, whether Japan was already on the verge of surrender. The debate often ignored what Japanese leaders themselves knew in those final weeks. The scale of the American buildup, the sheer industrial and military might being brought to bear, had already convinced the rational actors in Tokyo that continuing was suicide. The atomic bombs provided the shock, the face-saving catastrophe that allowed the military faction to surrender without admitting they had simply been outmatched. The Soviet invasion closed the last diplomatic exit, but the underlying reality, the one that haunted those late-night meetings in Tokyo bunkers, was the number: 2 million. Against that, against the full mobilized strength of American power, Japan had no answer. The casualty projections haunt historians to this day. Had Operation Olympic proceeded on November 1st, the fighting on Kyushu would likely have been the bloodiest of the Pacific War. Japanese defenders, fighting on their homeland with nowhere to retreat, would have exacted a terrible price. American estimates projected up to 50,000 casualties in the first phase alone. Operation Coronet, the assault on Tokyo, would have been even worse. Urban warfare, in a city where every civilian was mobilized to resist, could have produced casualties matching the entire European theater. Japanese losses would have been catastrophic, measured in millions when civilian deaths were included. The atomic bombs, horrific as they were, killed perhaps 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Operation Downfall might have killed millions on both sides. In this terrible arithmetic, the bombs become, paradoxically, the humanitarian option, though calling any weapon that vaporizes cities' humanitarian strains language beyond its limits. For the 2 million American servicemen who had been slated for the invasion, the surrender brought a reprieve that many never forgot. They had expected to die in the rice paddies and mountains of Japan, in street-to-street fighting through Tokyo. Instead, they went home. The Purple Hearts manufactured for them were stored away, to be issued decades later to different wars. The ships returned to port. The plans, so meticulously crafted, were filed away in archives. But for those who had seen the operation orders, who had known what was coming, the relief was profound. They had stared into the abyss of the war's final campaign and stepped back from the edge. In Japan, the surrender brought a different kind of relief. The country lay in ruins, 66 cities burned or bombed, the industrial base destroyed, millions dead or displaced. But Japanese civilization endured. The emperor remained, even if as a figurehead in a new democratic system imposed by occupation forces. Within a generation, Japan would rebuild, transforming itself from a militaristic empire into an economic powerhouse. None of that would have been possible if Operation Downfall had proceeded. A Japan subjected to months or years of invasion, urban warfare, and atomic bombardment might never have recovered. The society might have fractured beyond repair. The American occupation, for all its impositions, was mild compared to what a conquered Japan fighting to the last would have faced. The moment when Japanese generals looked at their maps and saw 2 million Americans represents something larger than a single military calculation. It represents the collision between an ideology that valued death over defeat and a material reality that made death futile. Bushido, the warrior code that had sustained Japanese soldiers through impossible battles, could not defeat industrial production measured in millions of tons. Spiritual strength could not stop battleships. Willingness to die could not overcome enemies who had more men, more machines, and were equally willing to pay the price of victory. The Japanese military understood combined arms warfare, appreciated tactical excellence, produced some of the finest soldiers and sailors of the war, but they had built their strategy on a miscalculation of American will, believing that a soft democracy would not endure casualties. When the Americans kept coming, island after island, and when intelligence revealed the true scale of the final invasion, that miscalculation became undeniable. There is a photograph taken on the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, showing Japanese diplomats signing the instrument of surrender. They stand stiffly in formal dress, surrounded by Allied officers in khaki. Behind them, American sailors crowd every surface, thousands of them watching history unfold. The Missouri itself is one ship among hundreds anchored in Tokyo Bay, a forest of masts and superstructures stretching to the horizon. This image captures the end. but it also illustrates the disparity. Japan's representatives sign away an empire while standing on an American battleship, surrounded by the physical manifestation of the power that defeated them. Not just one ship, but hundreds. Not just sailors, but millions. The Americans could have sent 2 million men to invade. They could have burned every city, fought for every village, occupied every prefecture. They chose in the end not to, but the capacity was there, assembled and ready. That capacity, more than any single weapon or battle, determined the war's outcome. The lesson of those 2 million, if there is one, extends beyond World War II. It speaks to the nature of industrial warfare, where production capacity and resource mobilization matter as much as valor or tactics. Japan fought brilliantly at times, with a dedication that impressed even enemies. But they fought a poor nation's war against a rich nation's might. The United States could afford to lose ships and planes and men, then build and train more. Japan could not. Every carrier lost at Midway was irreplaceable. Every experienced pilot killed became a permanent deficit. By 1945, Japanese training had degraded to the point where kamikaze tactics were not just fanaticism, they were the only way to employ pilots who had fewer than 50 hours of flight time. The Americans, meanwhile, sent pilots into combat with hundreds of hours of training, flying planes so superior that air combat had become almost unsporting. This asymmetry appeared in every domain. American submarines, operating with near impunity by 1945, had destroyed Japan's merchant fleet, sinking over 5 million tons of shipping. Japan's economy, dependent on imported raw materials, strangled. Food shortages became severe by 1945, with urban populations on near-starvation rations. The American home front, by contrast, experienced rationing as an inconvenience, not a crisis. The U.S. economy grew during the war, expanding to produce both butter and guns in quantities that seemed almost obscene. This was the force that Japan challenged in December 1941. This was the force that, by August 1945, prepared to bring 2 million men to end the war with sheer overwhelming mass. In retrospect, the outcome was never in doubt, though it took 4 years and millions of deaths to reach the conclusion. The men who would have carried out Operation Downfall, the soldiers, Marines, and sailors designated for the invasion, carried that knowledge quietly for the rest of their lives. They knew they had been scheduled to die in numbers that would have dwarfed any previous American operation. They knew the plans called for reserves because casualties would be so heavy the initial assault divisions would need replacement. Some felt guilt that atomic bombs killed civilians so they could live. Others felt only relief. Most never spoke of it much, the way veterans often don't. But in veterans' halls and reunions, sometimes the conversation turned to downfall, to Olympic and Coronet, to the invasion that didn't happen. They toasted absent friends who died on Okinawa or Iwo Jima, and they acknowledged the strange fortune that ended the war before the worst had to happen. In Japan, the memory is more complex. The atomic bombs loom large in national consciousness, cities of martyrs, evidence of American cruelty. Operation Downfall, the invasion that would have been worse, remains less discussed. It is easier, perhaps, to remember the sudden apocalypse of atomic fire than to contemplate the slow, grinding horror of an invasion that would have turned the entire country into a battlefield. Japanese historians who have examined the ketsu-go plans, who have studied what would have happened if 2 million Americans landed, tend toward a grim conclusion. Japan would have lost, but only after most of the population had been mobilized and killed. Cities would have been destroyed not by bombs, but by artillery and street fighting. The atomic bombs, in a bitter irony, may have saved more Japanese lives than they took, by preventing a campaign that would have killed millions. This is an almost unbearable thought, yet the mathematics support it. The Cold War that followed gave Operation Downfall new significance. The plans and casualty estimates were used to justify nuclear weapons, to argue that atomic bombs prevented worse horrors. This became doctrine, repeated so often it achieved the status of obvious truth. Yet the historical reality is more nuanced. Japan was defeated by August 1945, beaten by blockade, bombing, and the destruction of its military forces. The question was never whether Japan would lose, but how long they could delay the inevitable and at what cost. The atomic bombs accelerated the end, certainly. The Soviet invasion closed off diplomatic options. But the American buildup, those 2 million men assembling across the Pacific, represented the inevitable end state. Eventually, with or without atomic weapons, that force would have landed and Japan would have fallen. The bombs changed the timeline and the method, but the outcome was already determined by industrial production, resource access, and the willingness of the American people to see the war through to unconditional surrender. 80 years later, we live in a world shaped by the decisions of that August. Japan became a peaceful democracy, an American ally, an economic success story. The atomic age began, bringing both the terror of mutual destruction and the long peace between great powers. Operation Downfall entered history as the invasion that wasn't, a ghost of what might have been. But for those who planned it, who assembled the forces, who were scheduled to go, it was terrifyingly real. The maps existed, the plans were drawn, the men were trained and equipped, the ships were loaded. On Tinian Island, if the surrender had not come, the invasion fleet would have sailed on its appointed day, carrying 2 million Americans to storm Japan's shores. That it didn't happen represents one of history's great counterfactuals, a road not taken that leads to unimaginable casualties and suffering. The moment when Japan's generals looked at their intelligence reports and saw the real numbers, when they understood that 2 million Americans were coming, not 300,000, that was the moment the war ended in everything but the formal proclamation. The atomic bombs and Soviet invasion forced the acknowledgement, provided the shocks that broke the deadlock between the peace and war factions, but the underlying reality, the impossible mathematics of continuing to fight, had already settled the question. Japan could not win. Japan could not even fight to a draw. They could only die and die and die until there was nothing left. Some in the military were prepared to do exactly that, to embrace national suicide in the name of honor. That cooler heads prevailed, that the emperor intervened, that surrender came before invasion. These were not inevitable. The hardliners nearly succeeded in their coup. History balanced on a knife's edge, but the edge was already tilting, weighted by the sheer mass of American power mobilized for the final campaign. We remember Hiroshima and Nagasaki as we should, as cities of atomic martyrs, as warnings of what nuclear weapons can do. We remember the Missouri and the surrender ceremony, MacArthur's sunglasses and the Japanese diplomats in formal wear. We remember VJ Day, the kissing sailor in Times Square, the spontaneous celebrations of a war finally ended. What we remember less is that moment in a Tokyo bunker when officers placed pins on a map and counted American divisions, counted what was coming. 2 million men. The number that ended the war before it even needed the atomic bombs to do so. The number that said, in cold arithmetic, that Japan had lost not just a war, but any path forward except surrender. History turned on that calculation, on the moment when pride and ideology met mathematics and could not find an answer. The invasion never happened. 2 million Americans never had to storm Japanese beaches. The war ended in atomic fire and Soviet tanks instead. But in another timeline, one that came terrifyingly close to being real, those men would have landed and Operation Downfall would have earned its name. We live in the world where that didn't happen. We should remember how close we came to the world where it did.